Sarah was unable to pay for Peter and Paul's junior wake exam fees and was harassed by several people, including her pastor who tried to take advantage of her. This left her twin sons filled with bitterness, pushing them to join the Black Diggers gang. Soon, the gang leader called a meeting to inform them of an upcoming robbery. What Peter and Paul didn't know was that the politician they were planning to rob was their grandfather, a man they had no knowledge of. All they knew was that their father was a madman who had forced himself on their mother. When the day of the robbery arrived, Peter was shot along with the rest of the gang, leaving Paul as the sole survivor. He managed to escape with a briefcase full of dollars. When Sarah heard of Peter's current situation, she was devastated. Determined not to lose both her sons, she moved to another state with Paul and the money in the briefcase and hoped that Peter survived this alive. Honorable David sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the dim light of his bedside lamp. His recent discharge from the hospital after 3 weeks of recovery left him physically weak but mentally restless. The robbery had shaken him deeply, not just the violence of it but the implications that followed. As a seasoned politician, he was acutely aware of the schemes his colleagues often orchestrated. "It could be anyone," he muttered under his breath, tapping his fingers on his knee. He had heard countless stories of public funds being siphoned off, sometimes with the help of hired criminals. Even worse, some politicians deliberately staged robberies to embezzle money. This wasn't just about the stolen briefcase or the money it contained. It was the fear that his enemies in the House of Assembly would use the incident to frame him, branding him as either incompetent or corrupt. The stolen funds were worth more than his net worth, a staggering sum allocated for community development projects. "I didn't plan to steal it," he whispered to himself. But who would believe him now? Reaching for his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Daniel's name. His son had left for the UK years ago to pursue his master's degree after a series of personal and familial struggles. Chief among them was his guilt over Sarah, the girl he had wronged during his time of madness. The phone rang and Daniel picked up after a moment. "Father." David's voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Daniel, I need to speak with you." Daniel's heart raced. He had long wished for this call to bring news about Sarah and her sons, but his father's tone told him otherwise. David recounted the robbery, the deaths of 4 gang members, and how one had escaped with a briefcase containing the funds and critical government documents. The remaining 2 robbers were in custody. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Father, did anyone survive from the scene?" "Yes," David replied. 2 of them. One seems to have lost his memory, and the other is being interrogated." "Good," Daniel said firmly. "We'll find the one who escaped. I'm coming back to Nigeria first thing tomorrow. These idiots won't get away with this." David ended the call, feeling a flicker of relief but still burdened by the weight of the situation. The following day, Honorable David arrived at the police station. The 2 surviving robbers were being held in separate cells. One of them, a young man no older than 19, sat in the corner, his eyes vacant, muttering incoherently. The other, a hardened figure known as Shadow, sat chained to a chair, his gaze defiant. David approached Shadow first. "Where is my money? Where is the briefcase?" His voice trembled with restrained anger. Shadow smirked but remained silent. David turned to the officers. "What's his name?" "Rakwamika, sir. But on the streets they call him Shadow." David pointed to the younger man. "And him?" An officer replied. "His name is Peter. He's the one who was injured during the escape. He's lost his memory, according to the doctor." David stepped closer to Peter, his frustration mounting. "I don't care if you're senseless or insane. If you don't help me find my money, you'll rot in jail." Shadow, sensing the rising tension, chuckled. "Do your worst, old man. It's government money, not yours." David's patience snapped. "Torture him until he talks," he ordered the officers, pointing at Shadow. The hum of the airplane engine had lulled Daniel into a restless state of half-sleep, but his mind raced with memories. As the wheels touched down in Nigeria, he felt an unshakable weight settle on his chest. It wasn't just the gravity of his father's call, it was the ghosts of his past, now stirring awake. The airport was a flurry of activity. The chatter of travelers, the calls of vendors, and the rhythmic cadence of Nigerian pidgin English reminded Daniel of a life he had left behind. He adjusted his tailored suit, a habit he had picked up in the UK, but the fine fabric couldn't shield him from the heat or the gnawing guilt that consumed him. As the convoy sent by his father pulled up outside, Daniel caught sight of his mother through the tinted glass. She stood at the edge of the car, her posture still regal despite her age. Her face, however, betrayed years of worry. The moment he stepped out, she enveloped him in an embrace, her voice trembling with emotion. "Daniel, my son, welcome home." He held her tightly, closing his eyes as he fought back tears. "I missed you, Mama." Her hand lingered on his face, as if to assure herself he was real. "Your father is waiting for you. There is much to discuss." At home, the table was set with his favorite meal, jollof rice, grilled fish, and a side of fried plantains. The aroma stirred a memory of simpler times, but his appetite was dulled by the urgency of his father's summons. Honorable David sat in the living room, his face pale but his posture commanding. "Daniel, sit." As Daniel settled into the chair opposite him, David wasted no time recounting the events. The robbery, the deaths, the missing briefcase, and the implications for his political career. Daniel listened intently, his jaw tightening with every detail. By the end, he was gripping the armrests of his chair. "Father, do we have any leads?" David nodded. "Two of the robbers are in custody. One has lost his memory, and the other is being interrogated. The briefcase is still missing." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but determined. "This isn't just about the money, is it? You're worried about what they'll say." David met his gaze. "This is politics, Daniel. Perception is everything. If this isn't resolved quickly, it won't matter whether I'm guilty or not. They'll bury me." Daniel's expression hardened. "Then we'll find the briefcase and silence anyone who tries to frame you. I'll go to the police station tomorrow." As the night wore on, Daniel retreated to his old room. The familiar creak of the bed as he sat down brought an unexpected pang of nostalgia. But as he stared at the ceiling, his thoughts shifted to Sarah and her sons. He had avoided thinking about them for years, burying himself in work and studies abroad. Yet now their faces surfaced in his mind, Sarah's tear-streaked cheeks, the twins' innocent eyes. He remembered the priest's ominous warning. The police station was dimly lit, the air thick with a mix of sweat and stale cigarette smoke. Honorable David and Daniel stepped into the holding area, their polished shoes echoing on the concrete floor. The metallic clang of cell doors and the low murmur of voices filled the space, but all fell silent as the two men walked in. At the far end of the corridor, two men sat in a dingy cell. One was slumped in a corner, his head bobbing weakly, his eyes vacant. The other, bound to a chair, glared defiantly at anyone who dared to meet his gaze. The officer in charge, a wiry man with a scar running down his left cheek, saluted briskly. "Sir, this is Shadow," he said, nodding toward the defiant man. "The other one, Peter, is... well, he hasn't said a word since we brought him in. He's out of it." Honorable David stepped forward, his voice cold and sharp. "Shadow, where is my money?" Shadow smirked, his lips curling upward in a mockery of a smile. "Your money? That government money you were planning to pocket? I don't know what you're talking about." David's nostrils flared as he turned to the officer. "Get him talking. I want answers." The officer nodded, gesturing to his men. Two burly policemen entered the cell, their faces devoid of emotion. Without hesitation, they dragged Shadow to his feet and chained him to a metal chair bolted to the floor. Daniel, who had been silent up to this point, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. He grabbed Shadow by the collar, his voice low but laced with menace. "Listen carefully, Shadow. My father's money isn't just money. It's tied to projects that this community desperately needs. If you don't tell us where it is, I'll make sure you never see daylight again." Shadow chuckled, his voice raspy. "Go ahead. Kill me. I've got nothing to lose." Daniel's grip tightened, his face inches from Shadow's. "You think this is a joke? You think I won't make good on my promise?" Honorable David gestured for Daniel to step back. "Let the officers handle him." The room became a theater of brutality. The officers began their work, methodically breaking down Shadow's bravado. They dunked his head into a bucket of water, holding him under just long enough to make him gasp for air when they pulled him out. They applied pressure to his arms and legs, bending them in ways that made him scream. Shadow gritted his teeth, sweat dripping down his face. "I'll never talk," he spat, but his resolve was beginning to waver. Hours passed, and Shadow's resistance began to crumble. His breaths came in ragged gasps, and his once defiant eyes now darted nervously. Finally, his voice broke. All right, I'll tell you." The room fell silent as everyone leaned in. "It was Paul," Shadow rasped. "Paul took the briefcase. Labista gave the order. But Labista's dead now." The officer pressed further. "Where is Paul?" Shadow shook his head weakly. "I don't know. They never told me where they were going. All I know is, Paul mentioned Otola town before we split." Honorable David's eyes narrowed. "Is that all you know?" Shadow nodded, his head lolling forward. His body sagged in the chair, spent from the interrogation. Just as the officers were about to take him back to his cell, Shadow slumped forward, his breathing labored. I didn't know it would end like this," he muttered. A moment later, his body went limp. The officer checked his pulse and shook his head. "He's gone, sir." Daniel clenched his fists, anger and frustration radiating from him. "We're running out of time. If Paul is in Otola, we need to move now." Honorable David nodded grimly. "Let's go." But as they turned to leave, Daniel glanced back at the second prisoner. Peter, the boy slumped in the corner, his eyes glazed over. A pang of unease settled in his chest. "And what about him?" Daniel asked. The officer shrugged. "He's useless. Lost his memory after the gunshot wound. Can't even remember his own name." Daniel frowned but said nothing. Something about Peter's vacant expression stirred a strange sense of recognition in him, though he couldn't place it. As they walked out of the station, the gears were already turning in Daniel's mind. Otola town was their next destination, but the tangled web of connections and consequences was far from unraveling. The drive to Otola town was tense, the air inside the car thick with urgency and unresolved emotions. Honorable David sat silently in the back seat, his hands gripping his cane as his mind raced through the implications of Shadow's confession. Daniel, sitting beside him, scrolled through his phone, forwarding Peter's picture to every contact he could think of. Police officers, community leaders, and anyone who might provide a lead. "Otola," Daniel muttered under his breath. "If this Paul is hiding there, we'll find him." As the convoy approached the outskirts of the rural town, a familiar sight greeted them. Mud houses, narrow streets, and clusters of children playing barefoot in the dust. Otola was a small, quiet town, where news traveled faster than the wind. The officers spread out, showing Peter's photo to locals. Some shook their heads, uninterested in getting involved with police business, while others offered vague hints of where the family might have been seen. "His mother's name is Sarah, right?" one officer asked, flipping through a notebook. "We've heard of her. She lived here with her sons years ago. Their house is at the edge of town, but it's been abandoned for a long time." When they arrived at the house, it was a shadow of what it might have once been. The roof sagged in places, and the walls bore the scars of years of neglect. Weeds had overtaken the small yard, and the windows were boarded up, casting the interior in shadow. David stepped out of the car, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. "This is it?" he asked, his tone filled with disdain. "Yes, sir," the officer replied. "But there's no sign of them here." Daniel pushed past them, his jaw set as he moved toward the door. He kicked it open, the wooden frame splintering under the force. Inside, the air was musty, and the dim light revealed sparse furniture, coated in a layer of dust. "They've been gone for long," Daniel muttered, his frustration mounting. But one of the officers, more experienced in reading signs, knelt near the door. He ran his fingers over a set of fresh tracks in the dirt. "Someone's been here recently," he said. "Look at these footprints. Too fresh to be old." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Then they haven't gone far." The officers began to search the surrounding area, questioning neighbors and shopkeepers. A vendor eventually provided a lead. "Sarah and her son were here 2 days ago," the man said. "She looked distressed. Bought some bread and bottled water. Didn't say much, but I overheard the boy mention something about a bus to the city." Daniel clenched his fists. "They're running. They know we're after them." The narrow room was quiet, save for the soft rustle of wind through the broken shutters. Sarah sat on a wooden stool, her hands trembling as she packed a small bag for Paul. She had spent the last 2 days in silent agony, replaying every choice that had brought her to this moment. The briefcase sat in the corner of the room, its presence like a ghost haunting her every breath. It was filled with money she hadn't dared to spend. Each time she reached for it, guilt clawed at her heart. How could stolen money ever give her peace? Paul entered the room, his youthful face worn with worry. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes flickering to the bag. "Mama, what are you doing?" She turned to him, her expression resolute despite the tears threatening to spill. "I'm sending you away, my son. It's the only way." Paul's voice cracked as he spoke. "Away? What do you mean? We're in this together, Mama. I won't leave you behind." Sarah reached out, cupping his face in her hands. "Paul, listen to me. You have your whole life ahead of you. This mess isn't your fault. It's mine. I should never have let you carry the burden of my mistakes." "Mama, stop." Paul pulled away, pacing the room. "We can leave together. The visas are ready. We'll go to the US. We can start over, far away from all this." Sarah shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "And what happens when they find us there? What happens when you're always looking over your shoulder, wondering if the past will catch up?" "No, Paul. This ends here." She stood and walked to the briefcase, dragging it across the floor. "I'm going to the police. I'll give them this and tell them everything." Paul froze, his eyes wide with panic. "No. They'll arrest you, Mama. They'll kill you. If that's the price I have to pay for your freedom, then so be it." Her voice trembled, but her resolve didn't waver. "I can't let you live your life as a fugitive, always running. I'd rather die knowing you're safe." Paul fell to his knees, clutching her dress. "Mama, please don't do this. We can figure something out." She knelt beside him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You're my son, Paul. You and Peter are my heartbeats. I would do anything for you, even give up my life. But you have to promise me something." He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "Anything, Mama. Promise me you'll live. Not just survive, but truly live. Be the man I know you can be." Paul nodded, his voice a broken whisper. "I promise." She kissed his forehead, then stood, grabbing the briefcase. "Now go. Catch your flight and don't look back." By the time the team returned to the city, Paul's description and photo had already been circulated to border patrols, airports, and major transport hubs. It wasn't long before an alert came through. At the terminal, Paul had been standing in line for boarding, clutching his travel documents and nervously glancing at the clock. He had tried to blend in with the crowd, but the sharp eyes of a border officer caught him. "Paul Nady," the officer had asked, his voice firm. Paul froze. "No, that's not me," he said, his voice trembling. But the officer was unmoved. "We've got your photo. You're coming with us." Before Paul could protest, he was handcuffed and escorted to a holding room. His escape plan had failed, and now he sat in a stark gray room. his heart pounding as he waited for what would come next. At the police station, Paul's arrival caused an uproar. Officers and officials swarmed around him, each eager to report the capture to Honorable David. When David and Daniel arrived, their faces were masks of fury. Paul sat slumped in a chair, his hands cuffed behind him. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with defiance. "You thought you could run," Daniel growled, stepping forward. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed Paul by the collar and pulled him to his feet. "Where's the money?" Daniel demanded, his voice echoing through the room. "I don't know what you're talking about," Paul spat, his tone defiant. Daniel's patience snapped. His fist connected with Paul's jaw, sending the young man sprawling to the floor. The officers didn't intervene. They simply watched as Daniel unleashed his rage. "You think this is a game?" Daniel shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "You've ruined everything. Do you know what you've done to my family?" Paul coughed, spitting blood onto the floor. "Your family? What about mine? We're not thieves, we're survivors." Before Daniel could strike again, the door to the station burst open. All eyes turned to see Sarah standing there, clutching the briefcase. "Stop!" she cried, her voice trembling with desperation. Daniel froze, his fist still raised. Sarah rushed forward, dropping the briefcase onto the floor with a heavy thud. "This is your money," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Take it and leave my son alone." David stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the briefcase to Sarah. "Where's the rest of it?" "We didn't take all of it," Sarah sobbed. "Only enough to survive. Please, he's just a boy. Don't kill him." But David's face remained cold. "Arrest her," he barked, pointing at Sarah. The officers hesitated, but they moved to comply. Sarah didn't resist as they placed her in handcuffs, her gaze fixed on Paul. "I'm sorry," she whispered as they led her away. Daniel watched her, his fury slowly ebbing into something darker, guilt. He turned to his father. "She doesn't deserve this." David's expression was unreadable as he stared at the briefcase, his mind already calculating the damage control needed for his reputation. That night, as Daniel lay in his room, he couldn't shake the image of Sarah pleading at the police station, tears streaming down her face as she begged for her son's freedom. Her words lingered in his mind, words of a mother desperate to protect her children from the consequences of choices born of hardship. The following morning, Daniel approached his father with a heavy heart. Honorable David sat in his study, stern and unmoving, reviewing the legal paperwork to press charges against Sarah's sons. "Father," Daniel began hesitantly, standing in the doorway. Honorable David glanced up, his expression hard. "What is it, Daniel?" "I have a busy day ahead." Daniel stepped into the room, his voice trembling with a mix of frustration and sorrow. "I can't stop thinking about that woman, Sarah." Honorable David's jaw tightened. "She raised criminals, Daniel. They robbed us of money that was meant to help this community. Justice must be served. I can't let emotions cloud my judgment." "But Father," Daniel argued, stepping closer, "they didn't steal out of greed. That boy, Peter, he's not even in his right mind. And Paul, he's just trying to survive in a world that's turned its back on them. Can't you see? This isn't just about justice. It's about humanity." David's eyes softened momentarily, but his resolve remained firm. "You're too young to understand the consequences of letting criminals walk free. The law is the law." Daniel's voice broke. "You're right, I don't understand everything. But I do know this. Sarah is not the enemy here. She's a victim of circumstances we don't even fully know. For once, Father, look beyond the rules. Look at the pain we're causing her. Please release her." For a moment there was silence. Honorable David stared at his son, weighing his words carefully. Then with a sigh, he leaned back in his chair. "I'll release the woman. But the boys, they'll face justice." "Father." "No, Daniel," David interrupted, his tone final. "The twins must answer for their crimes. That's non-negotiable. Reluctantly, Daniel nodded, knowing he had won a small victory but still feeling the weight of defeat. Later that day, Sarah was summoned to the Honorable's house. She arrived trembling, her face pale but determined. She clutched the edges of her worn shawl as she was escorted into the grand living room where Honorable David and Daniel awaited. "Sit," David ordered, gesturing to a chair across from him. Sarah obeyed, her eyes darting between father and son. Her hands trembled, but she clasped them tightly in her lap. David leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Before I make any further decisions about your children, I need to know the truth. Who are you, and why have you raised criminals to steal from this community?" Sarah's lips quivered, but she held her composure. "Sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "my name is Sarah. I am a woman who has faced nothing but pain and rejection my entire life." Honorable David's brow furrowed as she continued. "I grew up in a Mambala kingdom," she said, her voice steadying. "I was once a happy, carefree girl. But my life changed the day I met a madman, a man I tried to help out of kindness. He lured me into the forest one day and he took away my pride. I became pregnant with twins because of that incident." Daniel's heart sank. His breath hitched as he realized where the story was going. Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "I was mocked and scorned by my people. They called me the madman's woman. I tried to raise my sons with what little dignity I had left, but the stigma followed us. We were banished from the village, and I was left to fend for myself with 2 babies. No one would help us." Honorable David and Daniel exchanged a shocked glance. Sarah's tears fell freely now. "I tried my best to give my boys a good life, but every door I knocked on was slammed in my face. I worked day and night, but it was never enough. My boys dropped out of school because I couldn't afford their fees. I never wanted them to turn to crime, but failed them. I failed them as a mother." David's voice was soft, almost trembling. "Amambala? You're from Amambala?" "Yes," Sarah replied, confused by his sudden change in demeanor. "And the madman who did this to you?" Sarah shook her head bitterly. "I don't even know his name. He was just a madman who wandered the streets, playing music on his tin cans." She stopped as realization dawned on her. Daniel was staring at her, wide-eyed and trembling. "The madman," he whispered. "It was me." Sarah's world seemed to stop. She turned to Daniel, her eyes wide with disbelief. What are you saying?" Daniel collapsed and remained motionless. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The room spun around her as the weight of Daniel's confession settled in. Honorable David, pale and shaken, stood abruptly. "Daniel," he screamed, his voice trembling. "Chief priest. Someone call the chief priest. Now." He called the police station to release Peter and Paul and bring them to his house immediately. It didn't take long. The chief priest arrived. The room was tense as the priest adjusted his garments and began his story. His voice was deep and commanding, reverberating through the air. "Long ago," he said, "there were 2 kingdoms, Amambala and Uturu. These kingdoms were at odds, their animosity stemming from a violent land dispute. Blood was shed, and peace became a stranger. In retaliation, a decree was made. No citizen of Amambala or Uturu would trade, associate, or marry one another. To enforce this, an ancient curse was invoked, an unbreakable vow of pain and tragedy for those who dared unite these lands through love." Sarah and Honorable David exchanged uneasy glances. The priest continued. "Despite the decree, 2 lovers emerged from the warring factions. Their love was pure, untainted by the hatred that plagued their people. They vowed to be together, but their union was forbidden. In defiance, they made a desperate promise. If we cannot be together now, our bloodlines shall unite in future generations."
My love, although our communities don't typically marry within each other, our union today marks a new beginning. I make a vow that our children, or their descendants, will one day marry and strengthen our bond. If they fail to do so, they will face the consequences of breaking this promise.
The priest paused, letting the gravity of the tale sink in before turning to Sarah. Sarah, you are the descendant of the Amambala lover. And you, Honorable David, are from the Uturu bloodline. Your fates are intertwined. Gasps filled the room. Sarah clutched her chest, her breath quickening. What are you saying? She asked, her voice trembling. The priest fixed his gaze on her. Your life's tragedies, your pain, the deaths of your husbands, your suffering, are all remnants of this curse. And your sons, they are key to breaking it. Daniel, your son, was struck by madness because his soul recognized the bond between him and Sarah. The curse demanded fulfillment. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. This can't be true. Are you saying my suffering, my children's lives, all of it was predestined because of this vow? The priest nodded solemnly. Yes, every moment of pain led you here, to this moment. You must fulfill the vow. Without your forgiveness and love for Daniel, he will never recover. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her body racked with sobs. She looked at Daniel's motionless body, then at Honorable David. You mean to tell me that the same family that nearly destroyed me is also the one I was destined to unite with? David knelt before her, tears streaming down his face. Sarah, I have sinned greatly against you and your sons. I did not know. I beg for your forgiveness, not for me but for Daniel. He is innocent in all of this. Paul, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. His voice cracked with emotion. Mother, you always said you wanted us to have a father. And now, the same man who put us through hell is here, asking for your forgiveness. I don't understand it, but maybe this is how we heal. For my sake and Peter's, please forgive him. Sarah's heart broke at her son's plea. She crawled to Daniel's side, her tears soaking his lifeless body. She held him close, rocking him as she cried out, Daniel, wake up. Prove to the world that I am not cursed. Prove that my life was not in vain. Her tears fell onto Daniel's face. Suddenly, a loud clap of thunder shook the house. The skies outside turned black, and lightning illuminated the room. A strong gust of wind blew through, extinguishing the candles. Everyone froze. Then Daniel stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and he gasped for air as though coming back from the dead. His first word was a whisper, Sarah. Sarah sobbed uncontrollably. You're back. Thank God you're back. Daniel sat up, his gaze locking onto Sarah's. I'm sorry, he said, tears welling in his eyes. For everything. For your pain, your suffering. It wasn't your fault, it wasn't mine either. But now we can make it right. Honorable David embraced both of them, apologizing profusely. Peter and Paul joined in, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt the weight of her pain begin to lift. Weeks later, Honorable David arranged for Sarah and her family to return to Amambala. He spoke with the king and explained the curse, the vow, and the suffering Sarah had endured. The convoy arrived in Amambala to the sound of drums, flutes, and cheers from the villagers. Honorable David, Daniel, Sarah, Peter, and Paul stepped out, greeted by a sea of faces, some joyful, others remorseful. The king, accompanied by elders, stood to welcome them, but his expression was heavy with guilt. As Honorable David narrated Sarah's story, the curse, the vow, and her years of suffering, the crowd fell silent, the weight of their actions hanging in the air. When he revealed how Sarah's pain stemmed from a destiny tied to their ancestors, many began to weep. The elders came forward, bowing before Sarah. One of them spoke, his voice trembling. Sarah, we were blinded by fear and ignorance. We cast you out when you needed us most. Please, find it in your heart to forgive us. The villagers followed, kneeling, pleading for her mercy. Women wept openly, and men lowered their heads in shame. Sarah looked at them, her eyes brimming with tears. You banished me when I was at my lowest. You called me cursed, turned your backs on me, and even now my heart aches. My mother, her voice broke, and she paused to compose herself. She died shortly after I was banished. I was her only child, and she died alone. Do you know what that does to a daughter?" Her words cut through the crowd like a blade. Many wailed, falling to their knees. Sarah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "But today I let it all go. Forgive you. Not because it's easy, but because I need peace. For myself, for my children, and for my mother's soul." The villagers erupted into cheers of relief, but Sarah's heart remained heavy. The king stepped forward, offering gifts and resources as restitution, while the women of the village surrounded Sarah, embracing her and singing songs of reconciliation. As the sun began to set, Daniel took Sarah's hand and led her to the center of the square. The crowd quieted, sensing something significant was about to happen. Daniel knelt on one knee, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Sarah, you've endured more than anyone should. You've shown strength, resilience, and love even when the world gave you none in return. I can't change the past, but I promise to stand by you and make our future bright. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded. "Yes, Daniel. Yes." The crowd cheered as Daniel slipped a ring onto her finger. Honorable David immediately ordered more food and drinks, and the marriage rites were performed that night. Though joy surrounded her, Sarah's heart ached for her late mother. She visited her old home and stood before the grave, tears falling as she knelt. "Mama, they called me cursed, but I wasn't. I hope you can finally rest in peace knowing that your daughter is free." Back in the village square, Sarah rejoined her family, holding Daniel's hand tightly. The curse had been broken, love had triumphed, and Sarah, once rejected, was now celebrated as a beacon of resilience and hope. Paul was sent abroad for memory restoration and recovered fully. Both he and Peter were enrolled at Oxford University, their lives taking a new direction. Sarah and Daniel welcomed 2 baby girls, twins, into their lives, and the family thrived in happiness and love. Sarah, once banished and scorned, now stood tall as the matriarch of a family that had conquered fate and broken the chains of an ancient curse. The vow was fulfilled, and the curse was no more. Peace and love finally prevailed. And thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more captivating stories. Remember to like, share, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts.